Good evening. My name is Lisa Cariagalo. I'm the Vice President for Academic Development, Diversity, and Inclusion here at Brown University. And on behalf of Brown University, I'd like to welcome you to the 18th Annual Martin Luther King Jr. Lecture here at Brown. Today, we honor Dr. King's legacy of social justice, equity, and inclusion through this annual lecture. And often, with the work of Martin Luther King Jr. and certainly the civil rights movement, music and singing played a critical role in inspiring, mobilizing, and giving voice to the civil rights movement. Dr. King has always said that the freedom songs are playing a strong and vital role in our struggle. Quote, "They give the people new courage and a sense of unity. I think they keep alive a faith, a radiant hope in the future, particularly in our most trying hours." To lead us in song today, I would like to introduce to you one of Brown's own, Harmonizing Grace. Harmonizing Grace is Brown's only gospel chorus, but it builds on a strong history of gospel choirs and ensembles on campus. In 2012 and 2013, the chaplain's office hosted a series of probing conversations with students and alumni of color, many of whom expressed a desire for gospel musical expression and worship to be reintroduced here at Brown. And in 2013, with just a few committed inaugural members and funding and leadership from the Office of the Chaplains in Religious Life and the Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion, Harmonizing Grace was born, with critical leadership from Reverend Kirsten Boswell Ford, Associate Chaplain of the University for the Protestant Community. Now in its third year, and with generous funding from the university, Harmonizing Grace has expanded and includes over 20 members under the direction of Reverend Hans Phillip, and is an important part of the Black Church at Brown worship offerings. Please join me in welcoming Harmonizing Grace.
Hold on just a little while longer. Hold on just a little while longer. Hold on just a little while longer. Everything will be all right. Everything will be all right. Pray on just a little while longer. Pray on just a little while longer. Pray on just a little while longer. Everything will be all right. Everything will be all right. Sing on just a little while longer. Sing on just a little while longer. Sing on just a little while longer. Everything will be all right. Everything will be all right. Fight on just a little while longer. Fight on just a little while longer. Fight on just a little while longer. Everything will be all right.
Thank you so much for that selection. That was really terrific. Welcome, everybody. My name is Chris Paxson. I'm president of Brown, and it is an honor and a privilege to be here with you at the 2016 Martin Luther King Jr. Lecture. This lecture is 20 years old, and it's been offered to our community as an occasion to reflect on the words and wisdom and life of one of the most important figures in the history of this nation. Even more, it's an opportunity for us to gain a deeper understanding of Dr. King's legacy and recommit to the work that he began more than 60 years ago. So every year, the lecture features a thought leader, somebody very distinguished, who gives us a different lens through which to appreciate what Martin Luther King Jr. meant to humankind. Professor Jonathan Walton is here with us. He will be introduced shortly by Provost Rick Locke. And Professor Walton joins a distinguished list of individuals who've come to Brown and left us with a lot to think about. Before he's introduced, I'd like to share a few of my own reflections on why this lecture is so meaningful to Brown University. So I want to begin with really an existential question. What can we be in life? Few figures in history have answered this question with as much clarity and moral authority as Martin Luther King Jr. His words and deeds cultivate a belief in the idea that every single person has power. His life was about living in the moral moment and moving people to find their power and then to act on it. For him, rights weren't just handed out. They needed to be defended and fought for always. And, you know, this is really a very American story. It's what animated the American story. Dr. King understood that America was hatched by radicals who declared equality among all people, although obviously not fully living up to that vision themselves. He believed that loving and serving humankind, his purpose on earth, was the kind of radical notion that America truly needed. So on the strength of this belief, Dr. King and his movement challenged people to ask what they could be and do in life, shaping a very broad notion of social justice. And today, at Brown and across all the country, this notion lives on in the work of combating discrimination, strengthening diversity, and properly valuing the contributions of African Americans, Native Americans, first-generation college students, the LGBTQ community, and so many others who seek respect and dignity. So in part, the answer to the question, what can we be, it depends on how we exercise our power and who we are to each other. Martin Luther King Jr.'s answer was to work across divides, to broker conversations, to prompt engagement, and also to be irreverent. And this is something I really appreciate. When I spoke to students at our opening convocation about 2 years ago, I reminded them that this is exactly what we expect of them during their time at Brown. As I said then, as we look around the world today, we see people whose views on life have been shaped by experiences very different from our own. We learn from each other, we change each other. In many instances, we disagree with each other, but we wouldn't have it any other way, because we know that it's only through these regular and personal interactions with people who are different from ourselves that we develop our values, and we hone our senses of empathy, and we define in that process the people who we want to be. So in other words, now it's us here at this university who are brokering the conversations and prompting the engagement and being irreverent as we grapple with how to promote justice within a community that's committing to advancing society through our mission of discovering and preserving and communicating knowledge and understanding in a spirit of free inquiry. And through these conversations, many of them that demand that we stretch our minds and we grow our hearts, many of these conversations are difficult. And we're learning who we are when we're at our best, embracing power and striving for what we could be. Indeed, open inquiry and the advancement of knowledge are powerful currents of the King worldview. The conversations around racism and justice and inclusion we're having here at Brown are not, nor have they ever been, and I hope never will be, idle conversations. They do what Dr. King called for, precisely what he called for. They educate and they enlighten us, even as they are contested, even as they are often challenging. Further, they build on and honor the history of those before us at Brown, who've done much to shape a diverse and inclusive and respectful and loving community here, such as sustaining the university's longstanding partnership with Tougaloo College in Mississippi. So, most of you may know that just yesterday we released a new Diversity and Inclusion Action Plan, the work of many members of our community. And in this release, our conversations have evolved even further still, hopefully in ways that affirm the values that are central to places like Brown and Tougaloo: freedom of conscience, liberty of thought, a commitment to justice, a commitment to service of society. So in 1954, Dr. King spoke in Detroit about rediscovering what he called, quote, lost values. Lamenting that progress in building and acquiring things had obscured human connection, he said, quote, "The real problem is that through our scientific genius, we've made of the world a neighborhood, but through our moral and spiritual genius, we failed to make it a brotherhood." This quote, to me, speaks to the need for all of us to stand up and create the community, the nation, the world that we dream of. And I know we're not there yet at Brown and elsewhere. We have to keep striving, we have to keep moving, and we have to do our best selves if we're to keep this dream alive. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. Finally, one thing. I think it's very notable that the Martin Luther King Jr. National Memorial in Washington, D.C. is the first memorial on the National Mall to honor a person of color, and it's the only one that doesn't commemorate a president or a war. It's instead a memorial that celebrates the timeless themes of justice and freedom and hope, and a memorial that will forever remind us of what we can be. The Martin Luther King Jr. Lecture will no doubt always be a cherished event at Brown, because it really allows us to deepen the conversations we're already having, inform the actions that we're taking to build this irreverent and respectful and loving campus community that we all want. So thank you very much. With that, I'd like to invite Provost Richard Locke to offer the introduction of today's lecture. Thank you.
Good evening. How's everyone doing? It's great to see you here tonight, and I also want to thank the Harmonizing Grades. That was really, really beautiful, so thank you. That was really great. And it's really a pleasure and an honor to be here with you tonight, and a real honor to be able to introduce our speaker. My name is Rick Locke. I currently serve as Provost here at Brown. As President Paxson noted, one of the ways our community comes together to celebrate the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is with this lecture. And in doing so, we pay tribute to his commitment to achieving our nation's pledge of ensuring justice for all. And we honor his bold and brave stance of nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience as the means to provoke necessary conflict and change. We also remind ourselves that while substantial progress has been made in the nearly 50 years since his death, our work to attain the beloved community that Dr. King dreamed of is far from complete. Racism remains pervasive today in the United States. While it may appear different than the segregated lunch counters, restrooms, and water coolers of Dr. King's time, it is equally pernicious and at the root of a full range of social ills that plague us, inhibiting our capacity to be the free and fair nation of equal opportunity that we aspire to be. At Brown, as President Paxson mentioned, we have been deeply engaged in efforts to confront and address legacies of structural racism in our society and here on our campus. Many campuses across the country are seeking to do the same, in large part as a result of demands by students, faculty, and staff of color who experience or bear witness to ongoing discrimination and daily slights to human dignity. We have to change that, and we're going to be working very hard over the next several years to change that. Just up the road, our speaker, Professor Jonathan Walton, led the Working Group in Diversity and Inclusion at Harvard College, which released its report last fall. Harvard President Drew Faust's charge to the committee was to, quote unquote, ensure that all students benefit equally from all that Harvard has to offer. Having Professor Walton steward this work was both a natural and inspired choice, and we are delighted that he has joined us today to deliver his talk, Love, Power, and Empathy in the iLife Era. Born 5 years after the death of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., Jonathan Walton has demonstrated through his life and work the enduring influence of Dr. King. A social ethicist and scholar of American religions, Walton joined the faculty of Harvard Divinity School in July 2010. In 2012, President Drew Faust appointed him Plummer Professor of Christian Morals and Pusey Minister in Harvard's historic Memorial Church, a professorship established in 1854 to acknowledge the centrality of moral and spiritual development of students at Harvard. In the announcement of his appointment, President Faust lauded Walton, saying, quote unquote, he is among the country's foremost scholars of African American religion, a powerful preacher, a thoughtful pastoral presence, and a wonderful human being. His scholarly and ecclesiastical callings are mutually enriching in the best traditions of campus ministry. Professor Walton will bring new life to spirituality and religion at Harvard as intellectual pursuit and lived experience. He has gone on to do this, making Memorial Church, in his words, a community of social critique and human compassion, innovation and tradition, scholarship, veritas, and service, caritas. Formerly an assistant professor of religious studies at the University of California, Riverside, Professor Walton's research addresses the intersection of religion, politics, and media culture. Just a small aside, my daughter is in divinity school at the University of Chicago. When I told her that I would actually be meeting Professor Walton, she thought like, oh, this otherwise not cool dad is suddenly has a fragment of cool by actually being able to touch someone of his stature. Professor Walton is the author of Watch This, The Ethics and Aesthetics of Black Televangelism, a widely respected work that complicates our understanding of the Prosperity Church movement and its preachers. He has also published in scholarly journals such as Religion and American Culture and the Journal of the Society of Pentecostal Studies. Professor Walton grew up in suburban Atlanta in a household where the civil rights movement was, in his words, sacred history. He attended Morehouse College, where he earned a BA in political science. He originally planned on becoming a lawyer, but in part as a result of the religious scholar and longtime president of Morehouse College, Benjamin Mays, he opted the path of theology. Walton earned his PhD in Religion and Society and his Master's in Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary. He serves on several professional boards and committees, including the Board of Trustees at Princeton Theological Seminary and the National Advisory Board of the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at WashU in St. Louis. Professor Walton is outspoken on issues of social justice and uses all forms of media to shine light on the prevailing systems and symptoms of oppression that underscore the need for action. Today, we honor Dr. King and pay tribute to his values and remember his pilgrimage, our pilgrimage. I am certain that he would be gratified to know that this Atlanta-raised, Morehouse-educated minister, scholar, activist, and advocate is preaching, teaching, and working to expand justice, opportunity, and dignity for all. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Jonathan Walton to Brown.
Good evening to President Paxson, to Provost Locke. Thank you for that warm and kind introduction. Please, if I could have a copy of that introduction so I could share that with my mother and father. So the next time I ask them to borrow some money, they'll think I am somebody. To my dear friend, Vice President Lisa Cariago-Low, to the faculty and trustee members and students and victorious voices of Harmonizing Grace, and to all of you who have come here tonight to celebrate and honor one I consider to be the most valuable and important American ever born. I say thank you to you. The topic of tonight's lecture has already been stated. Just love, justice, and empathy in an I-life era. Love, justice, and empathy in an I-life era. Few would argue with anyone who characterizes the contemporary moment as a quote-unquote age of anxiety. In these days of high-speed innovation, economic insecurity, and horrific international unrest, it's easy to feel a little emotionally off-kilter. But for many people, it's more than that. Anxiety disorders and depression impact over a quarter of the U.S. adult population. Nearly 50 million people are prescribed Xanax, the top-selling psychiatric drug, and a growing number of children and teens are being diagnosed daily. Violence, family instability, addiction, and bullying are both causes and symptoms of this deadly disease. Well, the late, great 20th century theologian Paul Tillich is actually and oddly helpful here. Tillich, who was featured in Martin Luther King Jr.'s doctoral dissertation. Tillich helps us move toward a solution, I believe, by rightly diagnosing the problem. For one, Tillich begins by distinguishing fear from anxiety. Fear can identify an unmistakable matter which can be faced, confronted, analyzed, assessed, and even endured. Fear has an explicit object. What is more, fear isn't all that bad. It's humanity's biological alarm. Fear, in fact, is essential to survival. Anxiety, on the other hand, is nebulous. Anxiety is not fearing something as much as it is the fear of losing something, though we are not quite sure what. Anxiety does not fear an object. It is the negation of every object. This is why anxiety is most often expressed in the loss of direction, the erasure of the concrete. There's no semblance of being. For it's under the crushing weight of anxiety. For anybody here who's ever had a panic attack, under this crushing weight of anxiety, the only thing we can truly fear is the threat of non-being. The threat of all that we understand ourselves to be at any given moment being pulled from up under our proverbial feet. The ground of our being. That thing that you and I find meaning, identity, the thing we find ultimate value in, it's compromised. Thus, anxiety throws us into a volatile tailspin of emotional insecurity. This is also why anxiety strives to become concretized as a fear. It impels us to be anxious subjects, that we need to identify a subject, we need to identify an object, any object that we can identify as that which we're afraid of. From here, at another point, Paul Tillich goes on to name 3 prevailing forms of anxiety that I want to appeal to tonight as we consider this contemporary moment. For from each of these forms, the object of fear is actually produced. What did I say? Anxiety has to latch on to something. Well, first, there's that classic anxiety of death. It's that classic anxiety of death. It's not simply about having an anxiety of when the bell is going to toll for us. To the contrary, this anxiety of death is bound up with the inevitable dimensions of life that you and I like to call fate. You see, the contingent and dependent character of life cuts against the lies that many of us have told ourselves. The lies such as Enlightenment conceptions of rational autonomy, free will, and understanding ourselves as self-determining moral subjects. Well, that's all undercut by the irrational, the inescapable, interrelated nature of the human condition. If you've lived long enough or well enough, as my grandmother would say, you know that in this life there's many things you just can't control. And it's this form of anxiety often expresses itself in a fear of living a responsible life. We fear taking responsibility for the aspects of life that we can control and change, while also fearing being at peace with the tragic underside of life that's always bound to reveal its ugly head at one moment or another. But it's only when you and I are responsible for what we can, when we become responsible, and in the process of being responsible, we become irreverent. It's only when we take that responsibility, while also at the same time understanding that there are some things that are out of our control, that's when we will find the emotional buoyancy we need to endure the torrential storm clouds of an unpredictable world. Too many people, however, allow the anxiety to take them under. Some find solace, for example, in the cruel outlets of violence and addiction. Many of you, for example, may be familiar with the heartbreaking report about the high mortality rates among working-class white brothers and sisters in this country. The mortality rate due to suicides and substance abuse in recent decades can only be compared, some have said, to the HIV and AIDS epidemic of the 1980s. Though I do believe also we should put in there the epidemic of economic depression and violence within urban centralized city areas as well. But the Princeton economists surmise that one of the reasons for such pessimism in white communities that is contributing to this sort of addiction, suicide, substance abuse, over against black and brown communities and people of color that are enduring the same sorts of economic fragility and the same levels of social chaos. The same people that are just as socially, politically, and economically marginalized. Why? The economists surmise that it's quite possible that communities of color have built up a resiliency over decades of expecting less from America's promise. People of color have come to expect less from this fragile experiment of American democracy. And while that is not something necessarily that we should champion, it is something that could teach us a moral lesson about what it means to deal with anxiety as it relates to taking responsibility for the things we can and also knowing how to ride the wave of the things that we cannot control as it becomes a form of emotional buffer to keep anxiety at bay. W.E.B. Du Bois would have described this, Brother Kim, as the gift of black folks. And this is where and why. This is where and why we all have to join hands to face the future with courage insofar as you and I together reserve the right to demand the structures of justice rather than to believing naively that justice will ultimately roll in on the wheels of inevitability. Well, the second form of anxiety, this interrelated anxiety, is the anxiety of guilt and condemnation. It's guilt and condemnation because human beings cannot live up to or into what we understand to be our infinite freedom as finite creatures. Our best is never good enough. And when we are good, we are always aware that evil lurks within our own souls. And while some of us revert to self-harm by way of suicide and the dope house to combat the anxiety of death, many resort, I would argue, to God's house to allay the anxiety of guilt. The drug house or the church house. Two sides of the same dangerous coin. Now, I know some of you are looking at me crazy right now because I'm speaking ill of my own profession. Don't get me wrong, I am a champion of the role that faith can play in helping individuals and communities endure the vacillations and vicissitudes of life. But what I'm talking about and what I'm warning about here is those who treat religion like a drug. A numbing narcotic, something that will get us high from the contact smoke of an otherworldly outlet that will only leave us hungover from unfulfilled expectations. And if you look across the religious landscape, across all faiths, you will see a surfeit of examples of pie in the sky, instantaneous, miraculous, supernatural, quick fixes to alleviate the crushing quotidian pressures associated with life. And magical salvation is being sold to help us allay anxiety of guilt associated with being a responsible, interdependent, flawed, ethically dubious, and morally compromised person that each of us in this room is tonight. Salvation, unfortunately, can come with the false promise that we will be delivered from the pains, problems, perils, and perplexities of the world. Salvation can anoint our inadequacies. Salvation can baptize our bullcrap. And then salvation can allow us to transform our anxiety into a fear of an evil other. What psychologists refer to as projection. This could be one of the reasons that you and I know so many people who profess to love God, but they seem to hate everybody else. Salvation becomes a sword and a shield to protect us from facing our own inadequacies, and a penchant for evil and intolerance. And it becomes a sword to attack anyone who might remind us that we are not as pure and pristine as our faith has deluded us into believing. So the anxiety of guilt leads us to this narcotic of salvation, which leads to then the act of demonization, a fear of an evil other. I think the writer James Baldwin may have put it best when he described the moment that he decided to throw off the false garment of piety and assume responsibility for his own shortcomings, his own love, his own fears. It's when Baldwin writes in The Fire Next Time, he says, I made a deal with Jesus at the foot of the cross one day. I made a deal with Jesus that he would hide my sins from me. But Jesus didn't keep his end of the bargain. I guess Jesus was a better friend than I took him for. Take responsibility. And the final, as I move to Dr. King, and most prevalent form of anxiety is that existential question that your president pointed out in her opening remarks. It's the anxiety of meaningless. There's an anxiety concerning our meaning, our purpose, or our lack thereof. There's a negation of ultimate concern. There's an eradication of ultimate values that might otherwise animate our moral commitments. And I would have to say, from where I stand as a professor at a university not unlike this one, this seems to me the anxiety of meaningless that too many of our precious students are dealing with. And it's this anxiety of meaningless that leads to a fear of idleness. And this fear of idleness leads to extreme overcompensation. Think about it. I'm not talking about you, by the way. Think about it. Our students come to campus with 4 career options. I could be a doctor, I could be a lawyer, I could be an MBA, or I could be a loser. They pad their resumes with activities that neither sustain nor fulfill, and they run from pillar to post lest they be forced to spend 2 minutes alone to stare down the fear of being alone. Moreover, I've also come to believe that this fear of idleness can cause students to readily confuse idleness with sustained commitment. Because sometimes it takes dedication, discipline, and patience to commit ourselves to causes greater than ourselves. And it's this level of persistence and patience that can be mistaken by an anxious soul for idleness, because the anxious mind seeks distraction. This is why in some cases and on some campuses, campus protests will often last only as long as the day's Twitter feed. Not at Brown or Harvard, of course. Our commitment to justice issues will only last as long as the next story to make the news cycle. And our dedication to a cause lasts as long as it can captivate our attention. Too many of us have what I like to call a hyperactive piety. We have attention deficit devotion disorders. It's a result of our overcompensation. We try everything, but nothing satisfies. Thus, the springs of our passion on one day evaporates into the gases of indifference the next day. Our anger toward injustice one week is quickly supplanted by an insatiable lust for a new object of emotional arousal the next week. And it's this latter form of anxiety, it's this latter form of fear that's really moving me toward the heart of my remarks tonight. For I'm not necessarily interested in an ontological or metaphysical debate about the sources of anxiety per se, but I am concerned with the implications of our choice of solution. I'm scared that our commitments to justice and our capacity to love are being threatened by an anxiety of meaninglessness that's pushing us toward incessant stimulation. Consider the I-life moment in which we live. The lines between news and entertainment, the public and the private, reality and performance art have become so blurred that it's hard to even capture the state of the human condition. Real private lives have gone underground as we parade out avatars of our imaginations on Facebook, Twitters, blogs, Yik Yak, and other social networking sites. The documentary and fiction have become conflated within the oxymoronic realms of reality television. And our self-value and self-worth is now too often defined by how many friends follow us, or how many people like us on Instagram, or our ranking according to some Google algorithm. I've already even alluded how this impacts negatively justice movements. We show up at a rally long enough to put a pic up on Instagram. We take to Twitter to humble brag about our involvement and then have delusions of grandeur about the efficacy of the moment. Y'all know how it works. I'm so humbled here. This is me on Twitter. I'm so humbled here to be here as speaker at MLK speaker at Brown University. I'm so humbled by this. While I tweet out a picture of me and the brilliant Andre Willis. Make sure I get that selfie, Andre. And then my next tweet immediately goes into delusions of grandeur, right? As I declare, we're going to make history here tonight for the cause of justice. Only long enough for me to get to the reception and hope that my tweet instigates another invite. Psychologist Shirley Turkle believes, however, that these larger cultural dynamics are simply masking and obscuring a larger cultural ailment. Our obsession with handheld devices, artificial intelligence operating systems, and the constant titillation of Twitter and other social networks, that's symptomatic. These are symptoms that these devices, quote unquote, solve without actually addressing what might really ail us. And here, Shirley Turkle picks up Paul Tillich's thesis from 60 years earlier. For we have found in our handheld stability, we've found the sort of stability that anxiety causes to elude us. Our devices provide our wish for realities and for relationships that we can have total control rather than have to be vulnerable at any moment. Has anybody here ever seen the 2013 science fiction film, Her? Has anybody ever seen that film? Someone encouraged me to watch it when I was preparing this lecture. You can find it on Amazon and Netflix. It's an interesting movie. I watched it the other night. It tells the story of a man who works as a writer. He writes love letters for other people. Yet his own marriage has come to an end because he cannot seem to tap into his own feelings or identify with the emotions of his wife the way he's able to imagine the love between other people. But his problem is solved when he begins dating Samantha. And Samantha is an interactive artificial intelligence software system that intuitively responds to his cues. He's literally dating his telephone. And though Samantha provided him with fun, she provided him with good conversation, this man was never able to quite find joy. He knew that when she sighed, Samantha sighed, it was not that she was trying to catch her breath, but she was mimicking emotion. He knew that when she giggled uncontrollably, it was not that she saw joy, but she was responding to what she perceived to be a joke. And he knew that when she was compassionate, she was responding to the sound of his voice, not the feelings of his heart. Unfortunately, my friends, this is a moral tale that technological promiscuity may keep us engaged, but it won't allow us to be fulfilled. And most importantly, for my purposes here tonight, we look to technology to fill our human vulnerabilities, but it short circuits our capacity to be vulnerable with other sentient beings. Thus, in Turkle's words, we keep expecting more from digital technology than we expect from one another. We are paradoxically alone together. And my friends, I'm here to say tonight, if love is the precondition for justice, we have to begin to ask ourselves, what is the precondition for love? I believe strongly that the precondition for love is empathy. an ability to identify compassionately with another. Not identify with them from a posture of self-care, because that can lead to abuse. Not identify with them from a place of power, because that will lead to pity. But empathy is the ability to put oneself in the place of another because of a shared set of experiences that are unique to any human being born of a woman. Birth, loss, love, joy, pain, and disappointment. In fact, empathy, prior to love, was at the heart of Martin Luther King Jr.'s moral vision. If I were assigned homework to you, I would tell you all to go home and open up a letter from a Birmingham jail. For you have to look no further than this powerful essay to see that Martin Luther King Jr.'s mature moral vision begins and ends with a commitment to love and justice grounded first in human empathy. This is why he begins with a simple premise about their engagement in Birmingham in the first place. What does he say? We are here, why? Because injustice anywhere is a threat to justice anywhere. Then King moves to the interrelated nature of humanity when he begins to riff off of his mentor, the late, great president of Morehouse College, Benjamin Elijah Mays, when he says that you have to understand that we are all inextricably linked by a common fabric of humanity and garment of destiny. What affects one of us directly affects all of us indirectly. And then he quotes the poet John Donne, "No man, no woman is an island." This is why King's vision of radical love that he moves in toward the end of this piece refused to demonize even the worst of his opponents and never sought to personally defeat or embarrass the most ardent upholders of injustice. Why? Because of an empathetic framework. King could empathize with Southern jailers insofar as Southern jailers, in King's eyes, have the capacity and potential for good, just as he knew he and other protesters had the capacity for evil. Now, let me be clear, I'm not talking about a moral fallacy of equivalence here. But King did hold on to the belief that all human beings could be reconciled. Thus, the greatest way to destroy an enemy for Martin Luther King was not, to use some of his later words, guided missiles being shot by misguided men. But the greatest way to destroy an enemy was to make that enemy a friend. And the only way we can develop the appropriate spiritual posture and disposition is by acquiring the capacity to affirm that person as humanly equivalent, not just in your eyes, but for King in the eyes of the Creator. Empathy is the disposition to live out agape, disinterested love. And it's this disinterested love that is concerned with the good of the other. And agape then establishes the social conditions to instantiate itself in justice forms and reforms. So therefore, if you want justice, you have to have love. And if you want love, you have to have an understanding of empathy. And if you want to have a precondition of empathy, then that means that you have to relate to other human beings. Which may mean in this particular moment, we are going to have to find a way to come off of our shadow limbs and embrace one another. On April 3rd, 1968, King painted this most poignantly in Memphis, less than 24 hours before he was shot dead. He painted it most poignantly when he told the story from the Gospel of Luke about a good Samaritan. King told the story, and it's a story of empathy. Because when a man went down Jericho Road and was besieged by thieves, his own kin and kind walked past and left him high and dry. When a Levite, a priest, a religious leader, walked by, he left him high and dry. But when a Samaritan, someone who was considered conventionally an enemy to the people, when he saw this man, he went out to help. Now, we could end the story there with King saying that that is a story of what empathy looks like. But King's radical love took it a step further, because rather than just simply empathizing with the Samaritan who empathized with the man who fell upon thieves, King made an extra move. And that is, he empathized with the foil of the story, the one who we could easily demonize, the Levite priest. Because he said, I can understand why that man may have kept walking upon his way, due to the fact that this was a dangerous road. And the man may have been concerned about thieves might have still been hanging around out there and could have attacked him. So possibly and understandably, the Levite priest may have said simply, if I stop to help this man, what might happen to me? That's conventional wisdom. But Martin Luther King proceeded to subvert that sort of conventional wisdom with another question. We can emphasize and ask, if I stop and help this man, what might happen to me? That's understandable. But empathy demands of us this question. If I don't stop and help this man, what might happen to me? And for King, that is the greater question that radical love demands of us. When we put ourselves in the position of another, even though we understand self-concern and self-protection, we have to also understand that we are so inextricably bound up with one another that self-concern also demands sometimes a selfless giving of the other. Because we're actually protecting our souls by protecting the physical needs of somebody else. And I guess I'm here to suggest on tonight that until you and I become secure enough to acknowledge and face down our own financial and emotional insecurities, we will never be able to empathize with families in this nation being trampled by the iron feet of economic oppression. Until you and I become comfortable enough with our own sense of vulnerability, you and I won't find what my dear brother David Kim refers to as a melancholic freedom to align with those who can keep working for justice while singing the blues. And unless you and I call into question our addiction to concupiscent self-reflection in our iPhones and avatars, we won't ever strengthen our emotional capacity to see not just ourselves in others, but to see God in the face of another. To do this, we must truly find a way to address our anxieties and acknowledge our fears. Martin Luther King Jr. had it right. Faith in an ultimate value greater than ourselves is the only thing that will vanquish our fears. And love is the only thing that will eradicate hate. Faith endows us with the conviction that we are not alone in this vast, uncertain universe. There's greater meaning and purpose than our own narrow needs and our own parochial desires. And if if you and I simply live our lives trying to protect our own corner of a carved out existence, then you and I will affirm that life is little more than meaningless chaos. But when we take responsibility for our neighbors, when we're armed with the weapons of love, we can ask the question, whom shall I fear? When we go on the offensive shrouded in the armor of justice, we can rightly ask, of whom shall I be afraid? This is why I'll end with the author, poet Marianne Williamson tonight, for I think she has it right. Our greatest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our greatest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. Our playing small does not serve the world. There's nothing enlightened about shrinking. We're all meant to shine. We were born to make manifest the love of God that was within all of us. And that is why we declare that the love of God and the love of humanity is one love. God bless you. Thank you. Questions, comments, concerns, pushbacks?
Thank you for visiting. We really appreciate you being here. It means a lot to us that you would take time to come visit us. I'm wondering if the message of Dr. King and the principles of nonviolence, the steps of nonviolence, if there's a method for teaching those consistently up at Harvard. I'm under the belief that we need like a Center for Nonviolence here at Brown University to consistently teach the methods and steps of nonviolence. I'm wondering if such a method, a system, a center exists at Harvard University, if you're aware of that, and maybe you could help us see an example of maybe something we could try here at Brown University.
We do not have that currently at Harvard University, though there is an example. The first that comes to my mind is the Leadership Institute at Martin Luther King's alma mater of Morehouse College. It was tied with the Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel and the Leadership Institute, and at the time it was under the direction of Walter Fluker, Professor Walter Fluker, who is now the Martin Luther King Jr. Chair at Boston University as of a few years ago. In terms of how that program has transitioned, whether it's remained in place at Morehouse and or whether it's being redeveloped at Boston, I'm not quite sure, to be honest with you. But I do know, in fact, that there is a curriculum that was in place as recently as 4 or 5 years ago. Yes. Thank you. Great question, and great idea.
Hi. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful and inspiring speech this evening. I'm wondering if you can, speak about our environmental crisis in the same language that you're using about human empathy. How can we extend our human empathy such that it encompasses our environmental crises as well as our human crises?
I actually think that there's multiple ways to talk about that. I could actually begin, before I move to the human dilemma, I could actually, in terms of kind of an empathetic posture, I actually can talk about where many progressive evangelicals are talking about it as it relates to human responsibility, right? As it relates to what does it mean to actually be a good steward of that which God has given us, right? And so therefore, they regard it quite often as a biblical mandate, right? That God has given us provision, and thus we have a responsibility. But also, I think that we need to look no further right now than what's captivated our attention, our hearts, and outrage. with what's going on in Flint in terms of the way that environmental concerns are a human catastrophe that unfortunately impact the most vulnerable among us, right, across the globe. And so therefore, if we're going to take this sort of posture, right, we see automatically, well, who should we be concerned with? Right? We should be concerned with those who are most vulnerable. Right? And it's this sort of economic catastrophe that is coming from hyper-consumerism, that's coming from hyper-capitalism, that's coming from hyper-militarization, that's actually just destroying the globe. Right? So I think your question actually had the answer in it. It just gave me a wonderful opportunity to expound on it a little bit. Thank you for that. Yeah.
My name is Earl Carlson, and I thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. I'm a social psychologist, and I've been in this business that you're in terms of the ethic and looking at society and looking at racial relations. This is a little short for me, but
I can hear you fine, Earl.
Yeah. Okay. In any case, I've been in this for about 80 years.
80?
Close to 80 years when I was got into early adolescence from high school. And I agree with you on many of the descriptive of where we are today and the history of the past. I've lived through this history. And I got into it in high school when I got into debate, and went on to graduate school at the University of Michigan and got my doctorate in social psychology there, and I've taught in different universities. I moved here with my wife from Southern California because my daughter and son-in-law are now in the history department here. And the sad thing is you're a pessimist.
Really?
Oh, absolutely.
Really?
I'm not a clinical psychologist,
Yeah.
but that's as a social psychologist, my diagnosis.
Really?
Oh, yes.
Oh, Brother Earl.
Social change is happening, just like technological change. I've seen it through my lifetime. I didn't work with Martin Luther King early, but I went in the March on Washington and I followed his work. I'm writing a book dedicated to Thich Nhat Hanh and Martin Luther King. You're familiar with Thich Nhat Hanh?
Yeah, well, let me say this. First of all, let me say congratulations. And if you've been in this field 80 years, I want to know what your diet is because you look amazing. But secondly, as it relates to the charge of my being a pessimist, I would probably say that I am hardly a pessimist. Actually, if anything, it's kind of a grounded in hope, right? And as one of my teachers taught, as David and Andre, we shared the same teacher, hope is different than optimism, right? Optimism is kind of an assumption that something's going to roll in on the wheel of inevitability, right? Where hope is something that's grounded in a belief that what could go wrong may go wrong, but one has to keep keeping on anyway.
Yeah.
And so therefore, when I think about social change, and particularly the seismic social change that we've seen in American society over your lifetime, we always see that it's a protracted struggle. Right? And injustice, in my view, is a many-headed hydra. And so therefore, whenever you think you've cut off one head, it pops up in another direction.
Yeah.
And so therefore, you always have to be vigilant and mindful about the unintended consequences of seismic social change. And it seems to me that part of the Great Revolution, and particularly the technological revolution that we have seen in recent years, while it has so decreased the world that we've lived in, and it has made us a global community in many ways, there is actual fear that I guess I was trying to name, that we might move from a conceptions of a beloved community that actually interface to an interconnected community that is more connected, but rather than interface, our forms of communication, our forms of protest, our forms of democratic deliberation become mediated by these hyper technologies, right? And that is, I guess, what I'm trying to sound the alarm against, so that hopefully these young people in 80 years can stand where you're standing now and testify to the same sort of social change that you've helped to bring about over your life and career. So, yeah.
Thank you. I contributed a little bit, a little bit.
No, but thank you, brother. I appreciate that. I appreciate you. I appreciate you. I think you have a question. I think there's a question standing behind you. Thank you, though, brother. I appreciate you.
Speaking of pessimism, I'm really interested in King's view and maybe your own view, too, of this relationship between love and justice. And it actually strikes me as an anti-pessimistic view because it seems like you're saying that social systems and large societies, large institutions can actually love as well as work for justice, as opposed to the idea that we have to settle for justice, as opposed to agapic love, right, in the wider society. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit, especially in light of things like systemic sin and social sin and how those might corrupt institutions.
Yeah, it's actually, that's a very good question. I mean, and King was very much influenced, again, this is why I started with Paul Tillich, right? I actually started from one of his works, Courage to Be, but there's another little pamphlet he has as a book of lectures that's entitled Love, Power, and Justice, that actually talks about the interrelated nature of all three of those things, right? And of course, you've put me on the spot, so I'm not going to quite get it right here in front of you. But it actually, power without love is essentially abusive, right? Love without power is anemic, right? And then, of course, when you establish justice, right? Well, what is justice? Justice is an actual social organization of what this kind of agape love actually looks like. So you can't ever divorce justice from love. And if we're going to talk about love and justice as being bound up together, then for King had this sense of the tragic, right? I mean, it was kind of come from his Christian sensibility. On the one hand, some might say he's influenced by Augustine. Others might just say this is a result of being raised an African American in the segregated South. But he had a real sense of the tragic dimensions of life, right? And that's what kind of kept him from falling prey. And let me say, it's not just him being an African-American man in the South, because there were other African-American men in the South, and now I'm thinking of, such as Booker T. Washington, that kind of did succumb to this kind of, false optimism and this kind of, this puerile, juvenile sense of hope. But for King, rather, it was this kind of Christian tradition and this constant notion of sin, right, that was ubiquitous. And it was always, and so therefore, we always had to be mindful of ourselves, because the very moment that we think that we are something over against evil, that we think we're something that they are not, then we've become guilty and we've become corroborators of injustice.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Thank you so much for that great question. David Kim.
Jonathan Walton.
Professor of Religious Studies.
What a wonderful talk.
Professor of Religious Studies from Connecticut College. The book Melancholic Freedom that I cited. Actually, I was quoting his book title with Oxford University
And that's
Press.
not why I'm standing up, but in any case.
This brother is just a brilliant, brilliant thinker that has had a wonderful impact on me and my understanding of these sorts of questions. So y'all give Brother Kim some love. And so now that
on that note of graciousness, Jonathan Walton, right?
Now that I did that, you cannot ask me a question.
No.
Right, sorry.
I think one of the powerful things that you knit together for us out of the Kingian tradition, right, is that the tradition of radical love itself is a tradition that can be recapitulated and joined, right, in our moment. I mean, if you think about the existential crises that you described, and you know, amongst the gifts that Black America has given all of America is to love in the face of absurdity, right? Like, why would you love in the face of terrorism, in the face of lynching? Why would you love in the face of all of this ridiculousness that's going on, right? And so, I guess one of the things that I wanted you to talk about
and
was...
it's why you can't divorce love from, just like you can't divorce love from justice.
That's right, but you also can't, you can't divorce love from courage.
Courage, that's right.
Right?
That's right.
I mean, because, you know, to expose yourself to the love that's connected to justice is to expose yourself to the chance that you might be worthy of love, right? King finds love in the face of absurdity. How? Because he says to those who oppress it, saying, I've been loved. I'm going to show you a form of love that you have not experienced, right? And I think, you know, in the moment that you're talking about where we're tied to devices, tied to the digital life, we may not be able to experience a fulsome love that King has, but we have to like, you know, chance on the glimpses of that radical love, and then, you know, take the risk that that's going to lead us to a life of justice. Can you speak a bit to that?
I don't think I need to. I'm serious, right? I don't think I need to in that regard. You know, I mean, you spoke about it, you know, so profoundly, and particularly as it's tied to justice. One of the things that I can actually speak about it, you know, is as the condition and the actual development and maturation of the brain that takes place in the earliest years, right? Where children actually learn how to mimic and learn how to identify outside of themselves and then with another, right? That's part of the love, and it's part of the care. And let me just say, that is part of, if I were talking in a different context, my fear with what people have called technological promiscuity. Because the very fact now that it's been documented that emergency room visits among toddlers has escalated as a result of our increasing dependency upon devices, right? And we're just talking simple. For anybody who's had the chance to watch a child, it does not take long to look down to a device to have that kid tumble off of a bed or walk into a wall or something. So bumps and bruises, right? And it's that, so we could start there with King growing up in our Auburn Avenue community, right? Sweet Auburn, right? That's right. In an extended intergenerational family. That's right. Right? Of parents, grandparents, larger church community. Right? That even though he lived in an apartheid state, right, his soul, his identity, his young consciousness was affirmed as worthy of love throughout his life. And so I don't think that we should miss that point as it relates to the larger structural aspects, right, as we think about this. And so I know that I know that others have talked about empathy as a social good, and even I heard Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, say that we should be careful that we don't devolve talk of empathy as it relates to ethics, so they become something that's interpersonal and not structural. And I absolutely get that warning. And that's why I also wanted to say I wasn't making a fallacy, a false, kind of false equivalency between King and the jailer as it relates to empathy, right? But at the structural level, if we are not equipped with these sorts of tools at the human level, right? Head and heart, then I don't believe that we can enact out this at a structural level as it relates to training people for justice. That's why the training involved the freedom songs. That's why it involved prayer. That's why it involved chanting and meditation, because King understood that the affective dimensions, right, that connect us as human beings are so prominent and pivotal as it relates to being able to stand down and have the courage that you actually talked about. So,
beautiful, man. Thank you.
Man, thank you. Thank you, brother. Thank you. Professor Andre Willis, Department of Religious Studies here at Brown University.
Yeah, man. Thanks for coming. It's nice to be in your congregation here at Brown instead of up at Harvard. But I just want to raise very quickly, I'm mindful of the hour, and I know we have another segment. So very quickly, I want to allow you the opportunity to speak a little bit more about the links between love, justice, and empathy in light of another figure, not to take anything away from Martin, but to kind of allow you to complicate and to speak a little more broadly about how different forms and modes and ways of loving are also part and parcel of the tradition that you're laying out. So I want to throw out Malcolm. And I want to throw out Malcolm's courage, sense of justice, and love and empathy, and allow you the opportunity to talk about how that strand of a certain kind of empathy, particularly given this moment where it might link to kind of a more organic sense of rage and anger a lot of young folks might be tapping into. King becomes this kind of older figure who radicalizes more toward the end of his life, closer maybe to a Malcolm vision. But younger folks might be more able to tap into a kind of Malcolm sense of empathy, love, and justice. So what's your sense of how these may or may not relate, and how do we think about these things vis-a-vis both of those strands of the tradition?
You know, when I think about empathy, obviously I've been, in trying to write about empathy, I've been, going back and reading, in the Greek tradition. And so, you read somebody like Socrates, right, who has a different kind of, that tradition, that particular Western philosophical tradition, right, is different than the tradition that King came out of, right? King comes out of this Jesus tradition, right? And so it's an empathy of a, Palestinian Jew hung up on a cross, right? That kind of courage. And it's that tradition that was nurtured in his community, as we just talked about. Malcolm was introduced to a different kind of love through the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, in my opinion. And it was a love, it was a different type of radical love that was bound up with a visceral disdain and hatred of white supremacy, right? And where King, in my estimation, right, King didn't necessarily have that same upbringing and path and introduction to that form of love. Now, Malcolm, right, you're talking about somebody that at his core just loved black people. And he loved black people in a way that at that time was not widespread, even among so-called, quote-unquote, black leadership, right? And could not be understood because there was a dynamic to racial politics in American society, right? That racial identity was that which was to be overcome, right? And unfortunately, King himself, particularly early on, you talked about later King, right? Early King, I could say, it's safe to say that he often fell prey to that too, right? That is to say, when we think about racial equality, when we think about integration, right? We can think about the day that we could actually begin to transcend these categories, right? Well, Malcolm had a concern about transcending that when there was such a binary between love and hate. That is to say, a love of whiteness as a default humanity. To be human was to be white. That's never called into question. But to be black is to be degraded, is to be subhuman, right? And at that moment, when other people weren't necessarily doing this to that degree, he was helping African Americans that you can't talk about justice until you have a kind of radical self-love, right? And truth to be told, I think he was in the gospel there because people say, love your neighbor as yourself. And Malcolm was clear, you can't love your neighbor until you love yourself, right? And so Malcolm, he was a flight attendant early on. You know when flight attendants say, in case of loss of cabin pressure, oxygen mask will drop down. And if somebody is, you traveling with an accompanying minor, put the oxygen mask on yourself first, and then put it on the person that you're traveling with. Malcolm was concerned and fearful that love talk was about taking that mask and proving humanity to everybody else by assisting and enabling and allowing white supremacist power structures to feel good about himself, right? So he would take that same reading I gave of King and empathy of the jailer, and he would use it against King like that. I don't agree with him, but I can understand his point of where he was coming from in context, right? And I think in that way, he actually contributed to helping sober King up a little bit, right? That you might need to take a little bit more seriously, right? The anger and pain and hurt these people who have been on the underside of oppression are dealing with before we actively and openly embrace those. Even though we do believe there's redemption in it ultimately, we can contribute to a little bit of self-love first. Is that kind of along the wheelhouse of what you were thinking of? I think, okay, all right. But that's kind of how I read that, and that's why I think that Malcolm is such an important figure in the history.
Hey, how are you?
How you doing, brother?
I'm doing well. My name is Antoine Matthews. I attend Tougaloo College, but I'm here on a partnership with Brown University.
Great, man.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think I read that you're from Morehouse.
I went to Morehouse, man.
Okay, I would like to talk about self-love that you spoke of just a few seconds ago. I have a few questions, more of a statement. I want to know, how can you influence other Black students? I went to a BSU meeting here at Brown Sunday night, the Black Student Union, and coming from an HBCU, you know, when we see each other, we're very happy. We want to see each other succeed. I wanted to know, how will you encourage the Black and brown community to reverse self-hate and appreciate ourselves? For 400 years, we were forced in this mirror to reflect on how we were defected. Even with social change, how do we appreciate our name? When I walk past some Black and brown people, they hold their head down. How do we address adversity when some don't feel we belong? We've been oppressed for years and now we're free. How can we help the ones who are still mentally enslaved? How would you address this change?
My dear brother from Tougaloo, listen, that's another one of those questions where the answer was within. Right? I think you nailed it. I think you nailed it. You know, you and I have a benefit that I must say that these brothers and sisters here, Black, brown, and at Harvard, I actually, you know, I find myself talking a lot to white working class brothers and sisters, particularly those from the South, from the Deep South, who kind of feel alienated, not in the same ways, but in similar ways, ways that resonate. Because you come to a place like this, right? You come to a place, these Ivy League New England spaces, right? And these places have the capacity to commit soul murder on you, period, point blank. And it's true for everybody, from the freshman that walks in the door to full professors on these campuses, right? It's why I remember Du Bois wrote the difference between being at Fisk and being at Harvard, right? His time at Fisk. And Du Bois said that, you know, it was a beautiful thing that he could be at a place like Fisk where he could take his humanity for granted, right? Rather than being at a place like Harvard where life was a perpetual job interview. And he was always trying to prove his worthiness. Right? And again, I want to make clear, that's true for a lot of people that walk into these spaces, across race, across class, particularly as Brown and Harvard are leading the way with financial aid and making it more accessible. Right? But we also have to realize, as we make it more accessible, we have to accommodate and the structures in such a way that we affirm students who are here for who they are, and let them know the second that they walk in the door, the second you walk in the door, right, that Brown is immediately a better place because you are here, right? Last year, a group of students started this campaign, and it was an artistic production and the like, and it was entitled I Too Am Harvard, right? And it was a wonderful play that took on the issue of microaggressions, for example, and they were letting it be known, right, that they have just as much right to be here as anybody else. And the only quibble I had with I Too Am Harvard was it put Harvard, right, it did not treat Harvard like it should have treated Harvard. And that is to say, Harvard became concretized. Harvard is a floating signifier. Brown is a floating signifier, right? So these students were saying, I too am Harvard, right? They also should have been saying, Harvard is me, right? What I bring to this campus, what I bring to the campus of Brown University, from Tougaloo, from Chicago, from McIntosh, Georgia, right? What I bring to this campus, right? This campus is better because I'm here. Right? And until we do that, I think that we're failing. Because we're trying to hit round identities through square cultural pegs, right? And I remember when I took the job, Vice President Lisa Carriago-Lowe, she was one of the people who hired me when I went into the Memorial Church of Harvard. Right, and I remember I went home and I told my wife about the opportunity that I had been offered to take over Harvard Memorial Church, right? And she said, well, there's two things I want you to be clear about, right? Both of my wife and I are from Decatur, Lithonia, Georgia, suburb of Atlanta, right? My wife said this. She said, there's two things I want you to be clear about. Number one, I'm not going to come to church every Sunday. Just need you to know that, right? And she said, second thing, Negro, if you start speaking with a British accent, I'm leaving. And I think she nailed it. She got to what could be considered part of the pathology of these spaces, that we are supposed to conform. And when I say we, I'm talking about all of us in this room, wherever you come from, right? And if that's how you speak, fine, that's who you are. Right? But what makes us beautiful is the diversity that is in this room, right? That contributes to the space, not us all trying to become a homogeneous block and monolithic blob of Ivy Leagueness. So, God bless you for that question, brother. Thank you. Thank you. I'll be real brief. I'll be brief. It's not the question. It's been me. I've been rambling. I'm sorry. I apologize.
It took me a minute to construct this. Thank you for coming. I'm so glad I made it here. I'm concerned about the politics. Can you address the anxiety and fear of our society in this current political atmosphere that we have? And what is our responsibility toward the justice of what we're seeing in the politics? Yeah. Okay, maybe that was a little question.
Yeah. That was a great question, and I think, and if anyone wants, I mean, I can make it available, make the lecture available, because I think foundationally and fundamentally, I was trying, in some ways, to speak to that while speaking to many other things at the same time, but though not speaking specifically to that, right? Because I don't want to reduce a framework, either a philosophical framework or a moral framework, to what we see going on in the contemporary moment, out, right? Because in that regard, I don't really see that as my strong area, right? I'm not a media talking head. I'm not a kind of politico. I'm not that kind of person. I just don't have those gifts, to be honest with you, to think on my feet like that. But I will say that it's what I was trying to identify in terms of when anxiety has to latch on to something. And there's different forms of anxiety, and those different forms of anxiety latch on to different forms of fear, right? And so I think we have seen cases here where a sense of economic fragility and economic security has caused us to lay blame with others. And unfortunately, all too often in political discourse, blame often rolls downhill. I think that there's a kind of anxiety of fate concerning the things we can't control. And I think that that has caused a hardened, concretized, venomous piety that has identified others as evil. And so it's interesting that those who appeal to the Constitution the most are those who are most willing to compromise and shed the Constitution when it comes to civil liberties of some. It is interesting that those who seem to advocate for a theocratic Christian state are the ones who are quickest to call out against those who threaten us with Sharia law. I think that it is interesting that those who appeal to communities of color and to progressive communities even, right, in terms of what we have to stand up for and stand up against, right? Those are all too often the ones that are willing to lay down to financial and money interests. And I think that there is a kind of anxiety and a loss of place and a negation that some might say is at the heart of all that. And if we're only worried about our political commitments and pragmatist commitments to winning, whether it's the next vote or the next election, and we're not grounded in a larger framework that I would say is larger than an economic or political philosophy, for instance, I think we'll always find ourselves in these sorts of compromised states. Listen, everybody, I love you. Thank you. I appreciate you.
It's so amazing, so amazing, your love for me, your love for me. It's so amazing, so amazing, your sacrifice for me, for every blessing, given to me. For every valley, you used to strengthen me. I don't deserve none of your love, your tender mercy. It's not for your grace, where would I be? So amazing, so amazing, your love for me, it's so amazing. every blessing,
for every blessing.
Give unto me,
Give unto me.
For every valley,
For every valley.
you used to strengthen me.
I don't deserve your love.
Endless mercies, if not for your grace.